But now, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, who is actually someone that I'm incredibly excited to hear from. I'm very proud to have as a keynote address giver, and I'm just going to read you a bio about him that was provided to me. So Carl Safina's writing about the living world has won a MacArthur Genius Prize, Pew and Guggenheim Fellowships, book awards from Lannan, Orion, and the National Academy, and the John Burroughs, James Beard, and George Rabb medals. His seabird studies earned a PhD in ecology from Rutgers. He then spent a decade working to ban high seas drift nets and to overhaul US fishing policy. These days, his focus is writing and speaking. Safina is now the first endowed professor for nature and humanity at Stony Brook University, where he formerly co-chaired the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. And he runs the not-for-profit Safina Center. He hosted the PBS series Saving the Ocean. His writing appears in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Audubon, and on the web at National Geographic News and Views, Huffington Post, CNN.com, and elsewhere. He is author of the classic book Song for the Blue Ocean. Carl's 11th book, Alfie Me, What Owls Know, What Humans Believe, published in October of 2023. He lives on Long Island, New York, with his wife Patricia and their dogs and feathered friends. So this is the bio that I was provided with to read, but on a personal note, I would like to make mention of the fact that my journey as an ornithologist and conservation biologist has been influenced heavily by Carl's work. Like many of you, my connection to birds and the natural world is one rooted in emotion. My career path has been driven not so much by the need to satisfy my curiosity, but by a sense of awe and amazement that I experience every time I see a bird in flight, or find myself alone in the woods listening to the dawn chorus fill the air. I always feel like I have a front row seat to the oldest and most refined orchestra on the planet when I'm out there. My drive to do the most good that I can comes less from an analytical interest and more from a desire to be compassionate to those organisms with whom we share this planet. And when I was beginning my career, I found that Carl's writing spoke to me in a way that no other author had. His thoughts on the importance of compassion and connection to the natural world validated feelings that I carried with me from a young age. I felt like I could be a more effective human being because of Carl Safina. And I am certain that I'm not the only one whose career and life has been impacted this way by Carl's writings. His text holds great power. In his own words, "We are one knot in a great web of being, building out the vast past and with luck continuing billions of years into the future until the sun dies, the last of its energy reaches Earth, and our local light goes out. The most appropriate response to the world is to realize with awe the ferocious mystery of being alive in it and act accordingly. The worst thing anyone should be able to say about their life is also the greatest thing anyone can say. I tried my best." I am grateful for the awareness that Carl has brought to us through his writings, and I am grateful that he is here today as our keynote speaker. So would you please join me in welcoming Carl Safina.
Okay, that was quite an introduction, if I say so myself. Now, the question is, can such a smart person figure out how to advance the slides? Oh, here we go. Okay. Thank you. All right, so can you hear what I'm saying? Okay, good. Today's talk is basically built around and off of my most recent book, Alfie Me. And this didn't work. Oh, there, it does work. Okay, good. Most people live disconnected from the world, from the living world, certainly. This is going to be a talk about connection. And it's built around the story of a little baby screech owl that was found on somebody's lawn a few years ago and rescued. When I got a text asking me, "Do you know what kind of bird this is?" from a wildlife rehabilitator who had been called, I had to squint at it to realize, oh, that looks like a screech owl, but it's dead, right? No, it wasn't dead. It was still alive, just barely. The rehabilitator did a really good job of cleaning this bird up, warming this bird up, getting rid of all the fly eggs that were in the matted down, and getting this little creature pretty much back to life. At that point, she came to live with me, and we were going to do a soft release in my backyard. Soft release meaning something like a young bird who leaves their nest, can go back and forth for a while, is not confined, and that was the basic idea. A pretty much a naturalistic release. So this little bird started to really thrive, and everything looked good and on schedule, except for one big problem, and that was that she had a flight delay. I say she because the usual default is to call everything he. We didn't really know what her sex was, but we started a habit of just referring to this baby owl as she. And the problem was, even though you see all of her feathers look really good here, but all of the long flight feathers were not coming in. Most of them just were not there at all. So, hey. So when she should have been flying, all she could do was hop and flop around. And that pretty much nixed the idea of a soft release. I had to wait to see whether those feathers would come in and whether they might molt properly. I didn't know. And in my experience as a wildlife rehabilitator eons ago, I knew that sometimes this could be a problem, and sometimes the feathers of a baby bird that had almost starved would never come in. So I really didn't know. So we put her in protective custody in our chicken coop for a while, and then she molted that first fall into her adult feathers, and she was perfect. And she just looked absolutely stunning. So I began to get her in shape for her eventual release. I used to be a falconer, using falconry techniques to get her in shape for flying and also for hunting. You don't have to teach an owl how to chase any more than you teach a kitten how to chase. But the thing an owl has to learn is that not everything you want to catch wants to be caught. So I would drag a fake mouse around on a string with a little food tied to it, and that fake mouse often did not want to be caught. So our little owl here, who I had named Alfie by this time, started to develop the skills of a hunter and the skills that would hopefully carry her through into a successful wild adult life. Of course, she had kind of an abnormal childhood. So when the day came that we finally left the door open and she was out the first night, I had no idea what would happen. And the next morning, this is what I found of her. A few of her feathers, obviously violently yanked out on the ground by our kitchen door. And I said a 4-letter word that pretty much summed up how I felt about this conflict that I always had about keeping her in total safety in a life that was a dead end, or letting her out into the dangers of the real world. And the dangers seemed to get her instantly. And I thought that was it. But of course, we had no carcass. And I assumed a Cooper's hawk had found her at dawn. But then I thought, well, wait a second. Maybe she was just attacked by blue jays, and a blue jay ripped out a few of her feathers and she flew away. I didn't know. I kind of assumed that was going to be the end of the story. And we left food out. Food stayed. Every morning we'd go out. The food was still there. About a week passed, And I was actually away when I got a text on my phone at 4 in the morning where I was. I was in Portugal, and it said, "Guess who's back?" It was from my wife. So Alfie was back, and Alfie was not starving. She was plump. After being away for that week, she had been taking care of herself somehow, but she decided to come back and center her territory in our backyard, in her familiar surroundings. I was really thrilled that she was still alive. I had spent a long time worrying about her all the time. I was really thrilled that she was still alive, and I was exceptionally fond of this little owl, and the feeling was mutual, as you can see. I should perhaps point out, this is not a trick photograph. I did not have a dead mouse in my mouth. She had simply come down to where I could, she came down to shoulder height, and I went over to her and I was giving her a little scratch, and I held my phone out to take a couple of selfies, and I decided to say, well, let's see what happens if I just turn to her to give her a kiss, and she just gave me a little peck on the lips there. So I was exceptionally fond of her by this time, and I was touched by seeing and feeling the relational capacity that this creature obviously had. And then a slight wrinkle, a love triangle. I'd like to tell you I wasn't jealous. She attracted a wild suitor almost immediately, and of course, who could resist a bird that looked like that? This is where things really got interesting, because I was trained formally. I have a PhD in ecology, and I learned in school, when I was in college, I learned that other animals, non-humans, they can't think, they have no emotions. Everything they do is trigger and response. It's all stereotyped behavior. There are no decisions involved. I learned all of that. I knew it was not true because as a little boy I had raised homing pigeons, and as an adolescent I was a falconer. I had a lot more experience with actual birds and their personalities than my professors did. So I knew it wasn't true, but I was taught those things. And when he showed up, I started to see more dimensions and more nuance in their personalities and behavior. Now, I should say that this was also 2020, when everything shut down because of COVID. So all of the travels I had on my calendar, even the teaching, it all went away, just like everybody's calendar got completely erased. And I had nothing better to do than sit in my backyard and watch owls for about 5 hours a day. And what could be better than that? So I would get up a little before dawn. I'd go to where Alfie usually roosted. I'd watch her get ready to come out of the day roost. She'd come out. Or in the evening, I would do the same thing, 2 or 3 hours each time on each side of the daylight. And at first, Alfie and this male on the left, who we called +1, I couldn't tell if they were actually hostile at first. They would chase each other around, and I didn't know if there was a wild owl trying to drive Alfie out of the territory or what. In a few days, I realized it wasn't hostile, but the calling was from a distance. It was highly energized. Alfie did not like him near her, but he persisted. He would come out of the woods. I never knew exactly where he was roosting. He'd come out of the woods at dusk. He would often go and find a moth and bring it to her as an offering. Sometimes she would not take it. Sometimes she would take it. Eventually, she took it each time, and eventually, they started to perch closer and closer to one another, and then Alfie would come out of her day roost, go over to near where I had hung up a nest box, and call and wait for him. He would show up, he'd go get her a gift, he'd feed her, and I watched their bond growing, their feelings of comfort with each other growing, and the similarities were striking between what was going on with them and what goes on with people when they're dating, quite frankly. So another thing that I learned in school is that birds have no facial expressions. You can tell nothing about their interior experience, which of course does not exist, by anything on the outside because they have no facial expressions. But as you can see here, +1 does not like me staring at him. And Alfie is completely in love. She's in bliss. She's between her two most trusted beings on the planet, him and me. And the difference is really obvious and really striking. So they began to do what young lovers do. You all remember this. And here again, Alfie had no experience. She was a young adult, and she didn't know how to adopt the proper posture for successful insemination. And I watched for, I don't remember how long exactly, maybe a week or a week and a half of them mating pretty energetically every day, and Alfie not getting it right. And I thought, whoa, this may not work out after all. Everything else is going well, but she's not doing it right. And then one night, I just saw her crouch in the proper position, and I thought, oh, that looks good. So I was hopeful that she would lay a clutch of eggs. As I mentioned, I had put a nest box up on this is the outside of my writing studio. That's my wife, Patricia, looking around for +1. Alfie is in the box. I had seen her checking out some hollows in some trees in our backyard, and as soon as I put that nest box up, I placed it on the outside wall so squirrels would not be able to reach it. She seemed somehow to intuit that it was a safe spot, and she took it right away. At some point that spring, I realized she was spending the day in the box, not in her normal roost in what I used to call the ivy tower, in a big cascade of English ivy on one of our maple trees. She was not in that roost anymore. She was in the box. So I thought, probably on eggs. And I was afraid to, as tame as she is, as tame as she was, I was afraid to violate the inviolability of that nest box site by going up there on a ladder. I just didn't want to shake her confidence in the safety of that site. But I realized that I could time it. Each evening, she would come out, go to the bath, take a bath, shake off. I'm wondering, is there any way to kill these lights right here, by the way? Can you kill these lights right here? So she'd come out, she'd take a bath, she'd go through a little spin cycle, and that gave me about 5 minutes to run up a ladder to the nest box and see what was going on in there. And yeah, that's exactly the right response, because that was my response also. You know, I mean, what in the world is more miraculous than a bird's egg? And they're happening all we almost never get to see actual eggs in wild birds' nests. Now, question was, were they actually fertile? And they hatched. To show you how small screech owls are, those are 3 hatchling screech owls compared to a white-footed mouse. So these are small, small little things when they first hatch. And the parents began to do their very competent job of raising their young ones. When they were little, they brought little things like bugs and mice, but as they started to grow, you know, there's sort of there's a very rapid period of growth. They began bringing meatier fare, like sparrows and other songbirds. And if you had asked me, do screech owls hunt at noon, and do they catch chipmunks, I would have said no, except when they do. +1 became a super big game hunter when his young ones were at their peak need of food. And Alfie raised 3 really healthy chicks who now faced leaving the nest box, which was a completely safe place, and going out in the world. The world is a harsh place, it turns out. And their first morning out was actually filled with violence. They were detected by some blue jays and robins who repeatedly knocked the young owls out of the trees, trying to hurt them, trying to kill them, I guess. If I had found a baby owl on the ground, I would have thought this is a helpless little thing that has no chance of getting up. And I discovered something that probably nobody here knows, because I didn't know it, that owls anyway, have this very weird instinct of they walk to the nearest tree and walk up the trunk, back up into the leafy parts of the tree. I just still am surprised that they do this, but they did it repeatedly, so it's obviously something that they know how to do. Anyway, Alfie was a very competent mother. You probably also know that when young birds are begging for food, the strongest ones get the most food, and the weak ones starve to death, right? You've all heard that. This is exactly the opposite of what I saw. What I saw was that her young ones were so stuffed with food by dawn that they often didn't want to eat anymore. And she would, if one of them took some food and then stopped eating and hopped away, she would go to one of the other ones and make sure that that one had as much food as she could possibly get it to eat. They were absolutely full all the time, and she would often chase them around trying to get them to eat more. It was kind of like eat your peas. No, Mom, I'm done. So Alfie had a name, +1 had a name. I wanted to name the young ones because the young ones were going to spend a couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, around the house, and I couldn't tell them apart. So I mentioned that to my wife, that I can't tell them apart. She said, well, why don't we just give them all a collective name? We'll call the young ones the Who. So we had Alfie +1 and the Who around the house, and it was really fantastic. Now, this is a 1-minute video that sometimes doesn't work. Let me see if I can make this work. If I can make it work, try to listen if there is sound, and if there's not sound, try to watch it. So it looks like it's working. This is one morning. She just came down within reach. Look at how she responds. That's her word for love right there. That's the most intimate sound they make.
Oh, it's nice.
And you see the way she's leaning into my touch there. Really, just like our dogs do, I would say. Well, that might seem very cute, but the thought that occurred to me was, why is this a surprise? And isn't it surprising anyway? Because birds and mammals have not had a common ancestor since before the dinosaurs, since about 300 million years ago. And yet the vertebrate nervous system was already so well developed that 300 million years later, a man and a screech owl can share the pleasure of a mutual touch. And I found that to be incredibly profound and incredibly touching. But it raised a big question for me, and that is, why was this a surprise? They've been like this since before we were here. We grew up in a world that included them. Why are we surprised that all these other creatures have these relational capacities? Is our disconnect a limitation of human intelligence and human emotional capability, or are we taught our disconnection? That was my question. So, to see if we're taught means it's cultural. I looked at what other cultures are taught about the living world. Indigenous cultures vary tremendously in many respects, but as far as their relationship to living things and the landscape, they are very similar. Indigenous people believe that the land is material and spiritual at the same time, that it is populated by beings who are all related, something that our culture did not get to until Darwin, and a lot of people in our culture still refuse to believe that all living things are related. If you look at South Asian cultures, the belief is that the world is material and spiritual at the same time, that the same soul exists in reincarnated states throughout all kinds of different forms of life, that the soul is equivalent and the life forms are equivalent in that way, that everything that is holy and sacred is in the world. If you look at East Asian religions and philosophies, there's this idea that all of the differences in the world that seem to be contrasting opposites make up the unity of the world. This is the idea of yin and yang. You cannot have up unless you have down. You cannot have forward unless you have backward. Hot without cold is not possible. Life without death is not possible. Life and death need each other in order to exist. And that the human role is to help maintain the world's balances, not upset the balances that keep the world whole. And then there's our culture, the West, which started in ancient Greece and has an outlying, radically different idea. And that idea is the world has no intrinsic value. The world has no spirit value. And the entire material world is here for human beings. Humans are better than the rest of the world. And our spiritual lives are focused outside of space and time, way off this planet somewhere. And that we should look forward to a time when we can reunite with the spirit world, which is not part of the material world. The material world is actually not a very nice place. It's filled with disease and decay and things like that. A philosopher named Crispin Sartwell wrote an opinion piece in the New York Times saying that this disconnection is the fundamental idea of our culture and the worst idea. One day last summer, my daughter phoned me and said, "I think our house is on fire. There's smoke everywhere." And I said, "The good news is it's not our house that's burning. Canada is burning." When the good news is that you can't see the sun because Canada is on fire, you know that we have created a big problem. The warming that the world is experiencing is because of excess CO2, and you all know that. Trees are the best and cheapest way of getting carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, but we're letting all the trees burn across Canada, across the West, throughout Australia, in Europe, throughout the Amazon. I was in Brazil last year. There was smoke in the air everywhere from the fires there. We can't solve a problem if our entire system continues to create the same problem, and we don't respond to these catastrophes because our culture believes that the physical world has no value. That's the fundamental idea of our culture. 50 years of talking about climate have done nothing to change the trajectory of the atmospheric changes that we are creating, because basically we don't really care. Humans take about half of the land surface to grow food. A lot of that food is obviously grown with lots and lots of pesticides. We garden with lots and lots of pesticides. It's not a mystery as to why there are no bugs in the lights in summer anymore. Half the land surface to grow food, to say nothing of the trillions of animals that we yank out of the ocean every year, because we simply believe that the world is here to serve us. That's our culture's fundamental belief. And the consequences should surprise nobody. Since I was in high school, since the first Earth Day, why did we have Earth Day? Because we've recognized we had huge environmental problems at that time. But since then, wildlife populations around the world have declined on a gross average of around 60%. Most of the big charismatic animals that we love the most are at their lowest population levels since humans appeared on the planet. And as we will probably hear repeatedly, we've lost a third of our birds in North America. 70% of all the birds in the world are now what we call poultry. And 96% of all the mammals in the world are human beings and what we call livestock. That is a world out of balance. But we don't think about, and the public in general doesn't feel these calamities really at all, I would say. And that's because we are taught our disconnection. When we graduate, we get handed our diploma, and they say, "Congratulations, graduate." We don't know where our food, water, energy, or all of our material life comes from, or where our waste goes. We don't know what lives around us. I have a friend who's a high school teacher. He asks his students to list 10 bird species, and most of them get as far as chickens and ducks and sparrows, and then they don't know. But we do learn one thing in school by the time we get our diploma. We know how to buy stuff. We've been enculturated, and we are called consumers, because that's our only value, really, to our culture, buying stuff. And so we have been enculturated to be totally disconnected from even the thought of our consequences. Well, what would it look like if we actually loved the world instead? We hear about tech revolutions. The latest tech revolution is artificial intelligence. But what we really need is a revolution in our most fundamental values, our valuation of the world itself. All technologies serve the values that send them. And moral revolutions like I'm talking about always seem completely unlikely, maybe even impossible, but we've had quite a few. Some of them extremely big, some of them a little less so, but all of them very consequential. Real human progress is always a matter of moral revolutions. And values are the most scalable thing. They're the perfect accessories. They go with everything. We take them everywhere we go. So it's time to retire this distorted view of the world that says that humans are the most important thing and the entire material world has no value other than to serve us, and to recognize the reality of a living world that is completely interconnected, where all living things have made the same journey that we have made to be here now. But if you try to wrap your limited human mind around the true complexity of life in space and in time and in all of its diversity, it is overwhelming. It's overwhelming immediately. So how do you react to something that overwhelming and actually try to absorb it and work with it? Reconnection and religion come from the same Latin root. And so there is a bit of an analogy between that kind of connection and that kind of connection. The Pope thinks that our connection to the world is a religious matter. The writer Paul Greenberg and I think it can be a religious matter. It can also be a very literal and very practical endeavor. We don't have to completely break up the landscape and leave no room for other animals to coexist with us and to travel on their life's journeys, but it does take some thought and some planning. You have to want to have elephants. You have to know about and want to have crabs migrating to where they need to get to breed. Last fall, 1,000 birds died during migration after hitting one building in Chicago. They had been asked to turn the lights down. They didn't care. A similar thing happened in New York City a few years ago. It turned out that just turning the lights off for a third of every hour let the birds reorient and go. The city of Philadelphia has decided to have a policy to give the birds literally a pass. So what should we do with all of this starting tomorrow? Well, I would say it starts with a desire to live in a connected world, in a connected way, and to stop seeing ourselves as consumers and transactional beings, and to see ourselves as part of an immense and ancient living network. Everything that we do all the time can be done with the rest of the living world in mind. Maybe we don't need half the land to grow our food. Maybe we can grow it vertically indoors without the pesticides and without all the fertilizers. People do know how to do these things, but the desire to do it is not very widespread, at least not yet. My dream is that we can connect abundant life, human dignity, and beauty with the great chain of life and time in everything that we do. Technology is not going to save the world. Hearts can, and hearts must, and I hope that hearts will. So we can open up and let ourselves into the living world. Alfie taught me that even owls have a word for love, and that if we care to connect, we can take those connections wherever we go. I'm going to just read you a little bit from near the end of my book, Alfie Me. Sensing connection to realities larger and more permanent than ourselves is the basis of religious feeling. All things that scaffold the life of this world, the waters, the air, the plants who make the form of oxygen that animals breathe, are indeed larger in space and across time. This confronts us with value of such enormousness, our entire existence, the sheer possibility of us, that we mostly fail to see it. Yet we can say, one needn't look far. Birds at a feeder, a flower garden, the wolves in our dog's clothing, they make those connections materialize. And of course, we had Alfie. Yet also, of course, Alfie doesn't always show up right away. Patricia and I sometimes have to wait, talking to the night air. Where are you? Where are you? As if reciting some sacred incantation in hopes of conjuring her. But if we can have faith in anything and feel certain that our faith is well placed, my faith is in the living. The religion that is followed is not religion. What is prayed is not prayer. Neither can what is spoken be believed. What lives and how we live, that is religion. Show me what you are grateful for, and I will know what you believe. Migrant birds etching the sunset skies, the harbor's humble clams, the long rhythms of whales in the seasons of fishes, these special owls in their leafy abode, in grand spectacle and subtlest detail, nature is scripture unscripted, delivered directly. Alfie's sermons are brief, but she is a powerful preacher. Alfie and I live the shared prayer. It's deep, but it's also delightful. Thank you very much.